So before I get started this morning, we want to honor one of our ministries. One of our small groups actually has been engaged in creating prayer shawls to distribute to people who have use for them. So I would like to ask for those who have been engaged in our prayer shawl ministry to come forward today.
There are 5 others.
If you, yeah, so
They're just 5.
yeah. So this is one of our ministries that actually reaches out into the community. We have some folks that have been helping us create these that are not normally with us on Sunday, and I'm very grateful for that and for them. So the idea behind these shawls is that we find people that that we think could use one, and we present them to them, but first we would like to bless them. So in a way, we're also blessing those people that will receive these. And for each one who receives a shawl, we affirm as you wrap yourself in the prayer shawl of comfort, the spirit of faith and compassion wraps you in its all-encompassing love. You find comfort from all that may appear too much to bear at this moment, from all that seems to threaten your peace of mind and heart, and you remember the truth. These prayer shawls remind you of the shelter for times of grief, the shade in times of sorrow, the shield from times of loss that resides within you as everlasting life, love, and happiness. You are comforted by the presence of those who love and support you, by faith in the eternal loving Creator who dwells within, by the prayerful hands that created this symbol of all that is. You are strengthened in your daily comings and goings, in your courageous new beginnings, in your continued healing. Blessings of the Spirit of comfort be with you and all you love, now and forevermore. So it is. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, boy. That's not good. When I start leaking before the talk, it's kind of iffy. So in looking at the material that I have for today, I could probably keep you here until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because I'm going to talk about Jesus. And given the amount of material that the Christian church has cranked out in the last 2 millennia, we could be here for a while. But I'm going to share a somewhat different Jesus with you today than most of you are probably familiar with. The basis for much of this came from one of my very favorite books about Jesus, which is called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time by Marcus Borg. I highly recommend it. If you have not yet met a Jesus that works for you, this guy just might do the trick. So, at the very beginning of the book, Marcus kind of describes the Jesus that we have been familiar with. Actually, a couple of them. The first one is that Jesus of, well, the Jesus of the deal. You know, you believe in me and you get into heaven, you don't, you go to hell. All right? And that's a Jesus that a lot of people accepted for a long, long time. There are some folks who had problems with that Jesus. So a smaller percentage of folks have gotten into a Jesus who is more of a teacher. Maybe they don't buy that old, sort of deal, but they say, you know what, he talked about some good stuff. Love your neighbors, love God, do unto others, all that stuff. I can buy into that. Yeah, that seems reasonable. He's a pretty nice guy. But when we explore what he was saying to us, he called us a whole lot deeper. What Jesus was calling us to was a personal relationship with God. A deeply personal relationship with God that leads to our own personal transformation. And that's a little bit different than the deal where, as long as you believe in me, you're going to get into heaven after you die. Or even, I've got some great stuff to tell you. So, where some of this came from is the author, Marcus Borg, was asked to speak with some people. It was an Episcopal men's group. His wife is an Episcopal priest. And he was asked to talk about Jesus and to make it personal. So one of the things that he did was he sat down and wrote out Jesus and me at the top of a piece of paper. And then he just started kind of free associating about Jesus and me. So I'd like to ask all of you, just for a moment, you can close your eyes if it feels natural, and go back and think about Jesus and me. Where did it begin? Was it the first Christmas I remember and someone said something about the baby Jesus? Was it when I was 3 or 4 and they taught me to sing Jesus Loves Me? Perhaps it was later in life. Maybe somebody told me about someone who could erase my sins and keep me from being cast into the fires of hell. We each had our own first encounter with Jesus. But the thing is, for so many of us, especially so many of us in this church today, at some place, somewhere along the way, the Jesus we were told about stopped making sense, or stopped being a guy that we wanted to follow. Maybe we found it difficult to believe in someone being dead 3 days coming up out of the ground. And then at some point later on, just walking up into the sky. Maybe it was all the things that the church we grew up in said to us and did to us in his name. But for whatever reason, Jesus just wasn't our guy anymore. Maybe we still celebrate Christmas, but it's really more of a secular holiday. It's more about Santa Claus than about Jesus. So one thing that I think is very useful to do, particularly in the context of the way Marcus writes his book, is, as he does, kind of separate who we're talking about here from what we may have thought Jesus was. And the way Marcus describes it is he describes pre-Easter Jesus and post-Easter Jesus. Pre-Easter Jesus was the guy that walked around. and talked and was on the earth with us. Post-Easter Jesus is about the experience of the people who were alive at the time of his demise and what it meant to them in the context of their society, in the context of their religious milieu, which was extremely rich and which they borrowed from liberally. But in terms of the scholarship of the guy that actually walked around Galilee and actually said some things that are attributed to him, when we look at that guy, he is very different from the demigod that the Church of Rome created Christianity around. And that's a good thing. I want to read you a couple things that Marcus wrote. So, one of the things that we have to look back at when we start examining what does Jesus really mean is then, if we're looking at who was he and what does his life mean, what does it mean to be a Christian? And I love how he says this. He says the Christian life is about entering into a relationship with that to which the Christian tradition points, which may be spoken of as God, the risen, living Christ, or the Spirit. The Christian life is a relationship to the Spirit of God, a relationship that involves one in a journey of transformation. If we are not being transformed by our faith, we are not living it. Couple of reminders. Jesus was deeply Jewish. Just putting that out there. Okay? It influenced him at depth. And we very often, I think, in the churches especially we grew up in, thought of him as being someone who came to bring a different religion. He did not. What he came to bring was a different way of being in the faith that he grew up in. Didn't quite work out the way that he had planned, I think. But he was Jewish, and it's something that we tend to brush aside. Interesting that the Jews were so intent on having a Messiah, he never claimed to be the Messiah. And although we may try to point some of the messianic prophecies, towards him, that was never his goal. He also did not preach about the end of times. When he talked about the kingdom of heaven coming, he didn't mean that the world was going to end and all the dead would come up out of the ground and all the stuff that we think of. He was talking about the kingdom of heaven that is right here, right now. He said that it is among us. It is within us. It's not some far off time. No great cataclysm has to happen except for maybe in our own hearts. So, in terms of describing what Jesus actually was, Marcus makes 4 points. And I don't even know if I'm going to have time to get to all of them today, but we'll dive in and give it a shot. The first point that he makes is that Jesus was a spirit person. And the way he describes that is by saying that he is one of those figures in human history with an experiential awareness of the reality of God. He says a spirit person is a person to whom the sacred is an experiential reality. We may remember the experience that he had upon his baptism and felt like the heavens opened up and the Spirit of God descended upon him. He spent hours in prayer and meditation at times. He would go off by himself to simply commune with the Spirit of God. It's funny, the first time this is actually one of the books I had to read in seminary. And I was reading it, and when I got to that part in the chapter that it's in where it described what a spirit person is, I looked up at Christine and I said, "You're a spirit person." Because she is someone who, based on the way that she experiences life and energy and spirit, she's somebody I would describe that way. I think Vanda is. So is Joanna. I was a little jealous. But I think it's not mine to be this time around, because it's up to me to sort of translate for everyone else. But when we look at what he said and what he was trying to get at, if we don't understand that about him, we can't understand what he was saying. He had a deep connection to spirit, and that deep connection informed everything he did and everything he said. When you look at the way that it describes so many times in the Bible that he spoke with authority, right? And it seems as if people then were surprised or shocked that he would do that, because he was not one of the high priests of the temple. He was a tekton. He was a guy that worked with his hands, But he spoke with authority from his own experience. It wasn't book learning he was talking about. He experienced God in the right here and right now, and he shared his experience of God with the people around him. He was a spirit person. And I love this. Marcus says that what Jesus' experience of God teaches us is that we may know God in an intimate way. And that believing in Jesus as a spirit person shifts the focus of Christian life from believing in Jesus or believing in God to being in relationship with the same spirit that Jesus knew. You feel a difference in that? One of the other main things that Marcus says Jesus was that he was a teacher of wisdom. And he primarily taught using parables, figures of speech, aphorisms. But he used them not to teach conventional wisdom, but an alternative wisdom. We've all heard conventional wisdom, and it's all that kind of stuff like, don't take the biggest piece of pie, mind your manners, look both ways before crossing the street, work hard, and you'll be taken care of. Conventional wisdom. Jesus wasn't having any of that stuff. Conventional wisdom is the wisdom of achievements and rules and earned worthiness. The alternative or unconventional wisdom of Jesus is the sure and certain knowledge of God's grace and compassion. So in the story of the vineyard, if you're familiar with that, the owner who pays all of his workers the same amount, regardless of how long they've been there or how hard they've worked, the people hearing it are invited into a world where everybody receives what they need. The workers who complain are the voice of the old world, the world of conventional wisdom. And the vineyard owner's response to them is striking. He says, "Do you begrudge my generosity?" That parable invites the hearers to consider that God is like that. He's not a God of requirements and rewards, but a God of something in seminary they taught us was prevenient grace. It's that grace that's already there, that we don't have to work for. We get it no matter what. Unearned. It's just there. Marcus says if we take the graciousness of God seriously, it completely undermines the world of conventional wisdom, whether in religious or secular form. This particular point about Jesus that I'm about to get on is the one that gets me in the most trouble. It's the one that got him in the most trouble. Jesus was a social prophet, similar to the classical prophets of ancient Israel. As such, he criticized the elites, the economic, political, and religious elites of his time, and was an advocate of an alternative social vision. And he was often in conflict with the authorities. You see, for Jesus, his whole vision of who God was different. It was different from the religion he grew up in, the religious authorities that were all around him, and of course the Roman authorities that used those religious authorities to keep the Jewish population in line. You see, in the Hebrew scriptures, the deal about being like God was to be like God. We must be holy as God is holy. That was the old deal, to be holy as God is holy. And the way that holiness had expressed itself in that culture was in a set of purity laws that ruled pretty much every facet of their lives. The purity laws ruled what kind of food they could put in their mouths, what sort of fabric they could put on their bodies, who they could eat with, who they could even touch on the street. Who one associated with was important in a way that we simply do not understand. And Jesus taught a very different lesson. What he said was, be compassionate as God is compassionate. And the word that is translated as compassionate, I've talked about this at least once before, I remember, is actually translated from a word which in Aramaic means womb-like or womb-ish. So if we think of God as having the qualities of a womb, it protects us, it holds us, it provides for us, it makes sure that every one of our needs are met. We are loved, we are supported. Be compassionate, be womb-like, as God is womb-like. It was completely different than to be holy, the way that they judged holiness in that society. And it ran him into a great deal of trouble. the thing that makes this, we could say, well, we live in a very different society today, right? We're not so worried about things like purity. But in the definition of our imitatio Dei, how we imitate God or are like God, we're not really so different from them. And Marcus lays it out pretty well. He says, one could make a very good case that we have a secularized version of the politics of purity. Our culture has increasingly maximized the rewards for culturally valued forms of achievement and maximized penalties for failing to live up to these same standards, thereby generating increasingly sharp social boundaries. Moreover, the notion of purity and impurity is at least implicitly present in attitudes towards the poor and people with AIDS. This was written some time ago. I think we've kind of gotten past the way we treated people with AIDS for a while. But I think he really nails it when he says our attitudes towards the poor. Because the imitatio Dei of our society today seems to be rich, like God is rich. When we look at what that really means, I get in trouble from time to time for mixing politics and religion, but Jesus made it very clear that there is no real difference. And I love the way that Marcus puts this. He says, the spiritual life and the world of the everyday are not split apart in the message and activity of Jesus, as they sometimes have been in the history of the church and in the lives of Christians. Rather, for Jesus, the relationship with the Spirit led to compassion in the world of the everyday. We can't just come to church on Sunday and then leave it at that door and go out there and try to compete in a me, mine society and call ourselves really Christians. That's not what he was about. I could go on, but I'll save the rest of this for another day. So often, we place things on Jesus that grew out of our understanding of Jesus post-Easter without realizing what actual experience the people had after he died, or the way that the religion about him was formed. And we never get past post-Easter Jesus to understand pre-Easter Jesus. But for me, in order for me to have a personal relationship with this guy, I had to try to understand what he was about while he was alive. And in this and in some other of the texts that I've studied by guys like Burton Mack and Richard Friedman, John Dominic Crossan, I've met a Jesus that I can not only believe, but I can believe in. Some of you may not agree with much or any of what I've said today, and that's okay. I'm not here to take anybody's Jesus away from them, right? What I'm hoping is that if you've been looking for your own personal Jesus, that maybe some of this resonated with you. Keep looking. That guy who lived in Galilee all those years ago lived with a grand purpose. The founders of all the other major religions lived to pretty old ages. It's very possible that his ministry only lasted a year. He died in his early 30s. He had a tremendous impact in a very short time. There is much that's there that we can learn from. But for me, simply understanding that we have the ability to be connected with Spirit the way he was, and that we can live from compassion, that we can be compassionate as God is compassionate. That's enough for my personal Jesus. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, Brother Jesus, today as we consider your effect upon this world, upon our traditions, our lives, our consciousness, we are grateful for all that we find in you, for the ability to be a champion of those who have been downtrodden, and yet to speak to those who seem to have it all. To know God as Abba, Papa, and to teach us that that is our Father. For all of your lessons and for your willingness to lay down your life to teach them. We're so grateful. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, sweet Spirit. So it is.